the hearing that morning, I noticed something strange about the way my parents looked at me. Not with anger. Not even with disappointment. But with something colder, something almost amused. Then my father leaned toward his attorney, just loud enough for the judge and half the courtroom to hear. "She's always been a useless daughter," he said with a small laugh. "Honestly, I don't know why she's even here." A few people in the gallery chuckled quietly. My mother nodded beside him. I didn't say a word. I just folded my hands on the table and looked straight ahead. The courtroom felt too bright that morning. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above us, casting a pale glow over the polished wooden benches and the rows of strangers who had come to watch the hearing. Some were reporters. Some were curious spectators. Most of them didn't know anything about me. But in that moment they only saw what my parents wanted them to see. A woman in her late 60s sitting quietly at the defendant's table, while her own parents accused her of being worthless. The clerk shuffled papers. The judge adjusted his glasses. And across the room, my mother leaned back in her chair, as if she were attending a theater performance instead of a legal hearing involving her own daughter. I remember thinking how calm she looked. Almost satisfied. As if this day had been coming for a very long time. If you're here listening to my story, thank you. Stay with me until the end. And if you'd like, tell me the city you're watching from. I always wonder how far these stories travel. Because what happened in that courtroom that day was something none of us expected. Not even the judge. The hearing was supposed to be simple. At least that's what my parents believed. They had filed a lawsuit claiming that I had no legal claim to the company I had worked in for over 30 years. According to them, I had never contributed anything meaningful. According to them, I was merely helping out. And according to their attorney, I had no right to challenge their ownership of the business. The attorney stood confidently at the podium, adjusting his tie as he addressed the court. "Your Honor," he began, "the plaintiff's position is very straightforward. The defendant," he glanced briefly in my direction, "has never been an official partner in the company. She has never held equity, never signed foundational documents, and never made any financial investment." He paused. Then he added with a faint smile, "In fact, her parents have supported her for most of her adult life." A few quiet murmurs rippled through the room. The implication was clear. I was a dependent, a burden, someone who had spent decades living off my parents' generosity. My father nodded proudly as if every word were a perfectly rehearsed line. My mother folded her hands in her lap and looked toward the judge with a patient smile. They were completely confident, completely certain, because as far as they knew, the paperwork told their version of the story, and paperwork in court usually wins. But courtrooms have a strange atmosphere. Even when people try to control the narrative, the truth has a way of lingering in the air, waiting for the right moment. The judge, a tall man with silver hair and a careful way of listening, leaned back slightly in his chair as the attorney finished his opening statement. He looked at me for a long moment. Not with judgment. Not with sympathy. Just curiosity. Then he glanced down at the thick folder of documents that had been placed on his desk earlier that morning. I knew what was inside that folder. But my parents didn't. Not yet. Across the aisle, my mother suddenly whispered something to my father. I caught only part of it. "Should have settled," she murmured. My father shook his head confidently. "She won't win," he said quietly. "She never finishes anything." That sentence lingered in my ears. She never finishes anything. It was something he had said my entire life. When I was a child trying to prove myself in school. When I was a young woman working late nights at the office. When I spent weekends rebuilding the company's accounting system, while everyone else went home. To them, none of it had ever mattered. Or maybe they simply never noticed. The judge closed the folder slowly. Then he looked toward my parents' attorney again. "Counsel," he said calmly, "before we continue, I have a question." The attorney straightened. "Of course, Your Honor." The judge tapped a single page inside the folder with his pen. "Are you absolutely certain," he asked carefully, "that the defendant had no meaningful role in building this company?" The question seemed simple. But something in the judge's tone made the room go very quiet. The attorney hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then he nodded confidently. "Yes, Your Honor. That is correct." Across the room, my parents exchanged a satisfied glance. They thought the judge was confirming their argument. They thought the case was already leaning in their favor. But the judge didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked down at the document again. And this time his expression changed slightly. Just enough for me to notice. Just enough for me to realize something important. The moment that would change everything was already beginning. And in a few minutes, the same courtroom that had just laughed at me would fall completely silent. The silence that followed the judge's question hung over the courtroom like a storm cloud that hadn't decided whether to break. My parents' attorney cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor," he repeated. The defendant's role in the company was informal at best. She occasionally assisted with administrative matters, but she held no official authority. I kept my eyes on the table in front of me. The wood was smooth from years of use. I traced one of the faint scratches near the edge with my fingertip, listening as the attorney continued explaining my life to a room full of strangers. According to him, I had been nothing more than a helper. A daughter who sometimes showed up. Someone who answered phones and ran errands. Nothing essential. Nothing irreplaceable. Across the room, my father seemed pleased with the description. He sat up straighter in his chair, his suit jacket neatly buttoned, his hands folded confidently over the table. At 78, he still carried himself like the founder of a successful business. Which, in fairness, he was. At least that's how the story always began. My father had started the company in the early 1980s when I was still in college. Back then it was a small logistics operation working out of a rented warehouse just outside Columbus, Ohio. 3 trucks, 6 employees, and an office so small that the desk touched both walls. My mother used to answer the phones during the day, while my father handled contracts and deliveries. It was a family business from the beginning. At least it was supposed to be. But like many family businesses, the story people told about how it succeeded wasn't always the same as the truth. I joined the company in 1989. I was 24 years old, freshly graduated with a degree in accounting, and convinced that helping my parents grow their company was the right thing to do. At the time, my father was thrilled. "You're the numbers brain in the family," he used to say. And for a while, things worked the way families hope they will. I handled the books. I built the company's first computerized accounting system, back when most small businesses were still keeping records in thick paper ledgers. I negotiated credit lines with banks. I reorganized the payroll system. And when the company nearly collapsed during the recession in the early 1990s, I spent 3 straight nights in the office rebuilding our entire financial structure so we could qualify for an emergency loan. Back then, my father called me his miracle worker. But memories have a strange way of changing over time, especially when money becomes involved. The company grew steadily over the next 2 decades. From 3 trucks to 20. From a small warehouse to a distribution center that covered almost 2 acres. We hired more drivers, expanded our contracts, opened a second office. By the time I turned 45, the company had become a respected regional logistics firm. And my father loved telling people how proud he was of what he had built. Was traveling the country, chasing business ventures that rarely lasted more than a year or 2. But 3 years ago he returned home. Not alone. He brought his new wife with him, Claire. I still remember the first time I met her. She was charming. Very polished. The kind of person who seemed to understand a room the moment she walked into it. Within a few months, Claire had become incredibly close to my mother. They had lunch together twice a week, went shopping together, spent long afternoons talking in the kitchen, while I was still at the office finishing the quarterly reports. And slowly things inside the company started to shift. Small things at first. Meetings I wasn't invited to. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Documents Daniel suddenly needed to review. Then one afternoon about a year ago, my father called me into his office. It was the same office I had been walking into for more than 30 years. The same desk. The same framed photos on the wall. But the conversation that day felt different from the moment I sat down. My father didn't look at me right away. He stared at the paperwork in front of him for a long moment. Then he said something I will never forget. "We think it's time to restructure the company." I asked him what he meant. He cleared his throat. "Well, Daniel will be taking on a larger role going forward. Daniel, the brother who had never worked a single full quarter at the company. And Claire has some interesting ideas about modernizing the business, my mother added from the corner of the room. That was the first moment I felt the ground shift beneath everything I thought I understood about my own family. But even then, I never imagined those changes would eventually lead all of us to a courtroom. At first, I told myself not to overthink it. Businesses evolve. Roles change. Families argue. That's normal. For more than 30 years, I had worked beside my parents without ever asking for titles or recognition. I believed that loyalty mattered more than paperwork. So when my father said Daniel would be taking on a bigger role, I nodded and tried to be supportive. Of course, I said. If he wants to learn the business, I can walk him through the financial system. My father gave a short nod, but something about the room felt different. Daniel didn't look at me. Claire smiled politely, but there was a strange confidence in the way she leaned back in her chair, as if she already understood something I didn't. At the time, I couldn't explain why the conversation left such a heavy feeling in my chest. Now I know. It was the moment the story about our company began to change. And I wasn't the one telling it anymore. Daniel officially joined the company 2 weeks later. On paper, he was listed as an operations advisor, a vague title that sounded important but didn't have a clear definition. At first, he mostly shadowed my father during meetings. He asked questions about shipping contracts, delivery routes, driver schedules. I tried to help whenever I could. One afternoon, I spent nearly 3 hours explaining our accounting software to him, how the quarterly reports worked, how we tracked cash flow, how the credit lines with the bank were structured. He nodded along politely, but by the end of the conversation, I had the uneasy feeling he hadn't really been listening. Not because he didn't care, but because someone else had already told him a different version of the story. Claire began appearing at the office more frequently. She said she was interested in the family business. At first, her visits seemed harmless. She'd stop by around lunchtime, bringing coffee for everyone. She'd chat with my mother in the break room, ask the drivers about their routes, compliment the warehouse staff. People liked her. She had a way of making everyone feel like they were part of something exciting. But slowly, her presence started reaching beyond casual visits. One afternoon I walked into the conference room and found her sitting at the table with Daniel and my parents. Papers were spread out across the desk. When I stepped inside, the conversation stopped immediately. It was one of those silences that tells you everything you need to know. "Oh," Claire said quickly. "We were just talking about marketing strategies." I looked at the documents. They weren't marketing plans. They were financial projections. The same reports I had prepared the night before. "How did you get those?" I asked. Daniel shrugged casually. "Dad gave them to us." That word stayed with me the rest of the afternoon. Over the next few months, the changes became harder to ignore. Meetings were scheduled without me. Emails about company strategy suddenly included Daniel and Claire, but not me. Once, I discovered that Daniel had presented one of my financial reports during a meeting with a potential investor. He stood at the front of the conference room explaining the numbers I had calculated. The investors nodded, impressed. And Daniel never mentioned my name. When the meeting ended, I pulled him aside in the hallway. "You could have at least told them I prepared that analysis," I said quietly. Daniel gave me a puzzled look. "Why does it matter?" he asked. "Because it's my work." He sighed like someone dealing with an unreasonable complaint. "Look," he said, lowering his voice, "you've always been good with numbers. Everyone knows that. But the company needs leadership now. Bigger ideas." I stared at him. "Bigger ideas?" He nodded toward the conference room where Claire was laughing with my parents. "Vision. Strategy. Growth." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Because everything he described, the financial forecast, the credit restructuring, the expansion plans, those had all been my ideas. For years. But suddenly the story was being rewritten. And I wasn't part of it. The real turning point came late one Friday evening. Most of the staff had already gone home. The warehouse lights were dim, and the office was quiet except for the faint hum of the printers finishing the weekly payroll reports. I was about to shut down my computer when I heard voices coming from my father's office. The door was slightly open. I didn't intend to listen, but as I walked past I heard my name. "She's too comfortable," Claire was saying. Her voice was calm, controlled. She's been here too long. Everyone assumes she's part of the leadership. My mother responded quietly. But she's family. Claire paused. Then she said something that changed everything. Exactly. That's the problem. There was a long silence. Then my father asked, so what do you suggest? Claire didn't hesitate. You need to formalize the structure of the company, she said. Define the leadership team clearly. Daniel spoke next. And if someone doesn't fit that structure, Claire finished the sentence for him, then they shouldn't be part of it. I stood in the hallway completely still. The words echoed in my head. They weren't talking about abstract ideas. They were talking about me. For the first time in 30 years, I realized something that had never crossed my mind before. I wasn't being promoted. I wasn't even being replaced. I was being removed. And none of them had any intention of telling me directly. At least not yet. After that night in the hallway, I didn't confront anyone. Not my father. Not Daniel. And definitely not Claire. For 30 years I had worked in that company long enough to understand something important. When people are planning something behind closed doors, they rarely stop just because you notice. They simply move faster. So instead of reacting, I did what I had always done. I kept working. The following Monday, I arrived at the office before sunrise, just like I had for most of my adult life. The warehouse parking lot was still empty. A thin layer of frost covered the asphalt, and the air smelled faintly of diesel fuel from the trucks that would arrive later that morning. Inside the building, the lights hummed quietly as I walked through the accounting department. Same desks, same computers, same stacks of invoices waiting to be processed. On the surface, everything looked exactly the same. But beneath that routine, something had shifted. You can feel it when a place no longer belongs to you, even if no one says it out loud. Around 9 o'clock, my father called a meeting. The entire management team was asked to gather in the conference room. That alone was unusual. We didn't normally hold company-wide meetings on Monday mornings, unless something major was happening. When I walked into the room, everyone was already seated. Daniel sat beside my father at the head of the table. Claire was there too. She wasn't officially an employee, but she had taken a seat near the center of the table as if she had every right to be there. My mother sat quietly next to my father. Her expression was calm. Too calm. I took my usual seat near the end of the table. No one said anything to me. Not even Daniel. My father cleared his throat and stood up. I've been thinking a lot about the future of the company, he began. His voice carried the same authority it always had when addressing employees. The logistics industry is changing. Competition is stronger. And we need a leadership structure that reflects those challenges. Several managers nodded politely. No one interrupted. My father continued. So after discussing it with Daniel and Claire, we've decided to restructure the company's leadership. That sentence landed heavier than the others. Restructure. In business, that word rarely means anything simple. My father gestured toward Daniel. Daniel will be stepping into the role of director of operations. Daniel straightened in his chair. Someone at the table clapped politely. Then my father turned toward Claire. And Claire will be joining us as strategic development advisor. Claire smiled warmly. Thank you, she said softly. It all sounded very professional, very organized. But the entire time my father spoke, he never once looked at me. When he finished announcing the new roles, he paused. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Then one of the warehouse managers raised his hand. What about the financial department? He asked. Are there any changes there? It was a reasonable question. For decades, the financial department had been my responsibility. Budgets, bank negotiations, payroll, tax compliance. Every dollar that moved through the company had passed through my office. My father finally looked in my direction. But the look in his eyes wasn't the same one I had seen for 30 years. It wasn't pride. It wasn't trust. It was distance. We'll be reviewing all departments, he said carefully. Some roles may shift as the company evolves. The manager nodded, satisfied with the vague answer. But I understood exactly what that sentence meant. They weren't announcing my removal yet, but they were preparing everyone for it. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. People stood up, chatting about the changes. Several employees congratulated Daniel. Claire shook hands with a few managers like she had already been part of the company for years. I gathered my papers quietly and stood up. As I walked toward the door, I heard Claire's voice behind me. "Oh, and one more thing," she said. Everyone stopped. Claire looked around the room with that same confident smile. "We'll also be conducting a full review of internal systems," she continued. "Financial operations included." Her eyes briefly met mine. Just for a second. But that second said everything. A review of the systems I had designed. The systems I had built from scratch decades earlier. I nodded politely. "Of course," I said. Then I left the room. Back in my office, I closed the door and sat down at my desk. The computer screen glowed softly in front of me. Rows of financial data filled the spreadsheets. Contracts, payroll logs, bank records. 3 decades of work. For the first time in 30 years, I opened the company's legal document archive. Not to review numbers. Not to prepare reports. But to look for something else. Something I had never needed to think about before. Proof. Because after that meeting, one thing had become painfully clear. My family wasn't just trying to push me aside. They were preparing to erase me completely. And if that happened, every year I had spent building that company would disappear with me. That afternoon, I didn't leave the office early. Most days, by 5:30, the building would begin to empty. The drivers finished their routes, the warehouse crew clocked out, and the administrative staff shut down their computers one by one. But that evening I stayed. The sun had already begun sinking behind the warehouse when the last employee walked past my office door and waved goodnight. "See you tomorrow," he said. I nodded and smiled. "See you tomorrow." The moment the front door closed, the building fell into the kind of silence you only hear after a long workday. No ringing phones. No forklifts moving pallets. Just the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and the faint ticking of the wall clock above my desk. For 30 years, that office had been my second home. I knew every drawer, every filing cabinet, every password to every system the company used. But that night, I wasn't working on payroll or financial reports. I was looking for answers. I logged into the company's internal archive system. The document database had grown massive over the years. Contracts, tax filings, loan agreements, employee records, shipping permits. Thousands of files. Most people in the company didn't even know how the system worked. But I had built the structure myself. Back in the late 1990s, when the company expanded beyond a dozen employees, I designed a digital archive that tracked every financial transaction and legal document the business produced. At the time, my father called it overly complicated. But banks loved it. Auditors loved it. And over the years, it became the backbone of the company's financial credibility. Now, for the first time since creating it, I searched the system for something very specific. Ownership documents. Corporate registration records. Amendments. Anything related to the company's legal structure. The first files that appeared were the original incorporation papers from 1983. My father's name was listed as the sole owner. That part one already knew. What I needed to see were the changes that came afterward. Because businesses don't stay frozen in time. They evolve. And sometimes those evolutions leave behind small traces. Tiny legal footprints that most people forget exist. I opened a file from 1994. It was an amendment to the company's banking authorization agreement. Back then, the company had been struggling financially after losing 2 major contracts. The bank had refused to extend our credit line, unless someone with accounting credentials agreed to take responsibility for the company's financial oversight. I remembered that meeting clearly. The bank manager had looked at my father and said very plainly, "We need someone who understands the financial structure of this business." My father had turned to me, and that was the first time my name appeared on an official company document. Not as an owner, but as the person responsible for the company's financial compliance. I scrolled further. There it was. My signature. Right below the bank's approval. That signature had kept the company alive. Without it, the bank would have frozen our credit line. And the company would have collapsed within months. I continued searching. Another document appeared. A financial restructuring agreement tied to the company's expansion loan. Again, my father's name was listed as the owner. But buried in the middle of the contract was a clause requiring that all financial planning be supervised by me. My signature appeared again. Then another file. Another loan agreement. Another expansion. Another signature. The deeper I searched, the more a pattern began to appear. The company might have legally belonged to my father, but every major financial decision, every restructuring, every survival moment during difficult economic years, had required my approval. The bank had insisted on it, because the bank knew something my parents were now pretending to forget. I was the one who understood how the company actually worked. Around 8 that evening, I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. Stacks of digital files covered the screen. Contracts, authorizations, financial certifications. My name appeared everywhere, not as an owner, but as something just as important, the architect of the company's financial system. Without those systems, the company could never have grown beyond a small family warehouse. And suddenly, Claire's words from that night in the hallway came back to me. She's been here too long. Claire had been right about one thing. I had been there a very long time. Long enough to know where every piece of the company's foundation was buried. And long enough to understand something my parents clearly didn't. They could remove my office. They could remove my title. They could even remove my access to the building. But they couldn't erase the work that had already been written into the company's legal history. Because every time the company had faced a crisis, my signature had been there. Just before 9 o'clock, I closed the archive system and stared at the quiet office around me. For years, I had believed loyalty would protect me. That family meant something stronger than paperwork. But sitting there alone in that dim office, I realized something important. The moment my parents decided to rewrite the company's story, loyalty stopped mattering. Only proof mattered now. And for the first time since the restructuring meeting that morning, I felt something unexpected. Not anger. Not fear. Clarity. Because if they were planning to remove me from the company entirely, then sooner or later they would have to explain to someone how the business had survived all those years without the woman whose name appeared on every financial lifeline. The following week, everything began moving faster. That's usually how these things happen. Plans that have been quietly forming for months suddenly unfold all at once, like a row of dominoes falling in perfect sequence. Monday morning looked normal on the surface. The trucks arrived before sunrise. Drivers checked their routes. Forklifts hummed across the warehouse floor. But inside the office building, something was different. I noticed it the moment I sat down at my desk. My email account wasn't working. At first, I assumed it was a technical problem. The company server had occasional outages, especially when the accounting department was uploading large files. So I restarted my computer, typed my password again. Still nothing. Access denied. I tried once more. Same message. For 30 years, that system had been my responsibility. And now I couldn't even log in. I walked down the hallway to the IT office. Tom, the technician who had worked with us for nearly a decade, was sitting behind his desk reviewing maintenance tickets. "Morning, Tom," I said. He looked up, smiling at first. But the moment he saw my expression, his smile faded slightly. "Morning," he replied carefully. "My email account isn't connecting," I said. "Can you check the server?" Tom hesitated, just for a second. Then he glanced at his computer screen and sighed quietly. "I was wondering when you'd come down here," he said. Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" I asked. Tom leaned back in his chair. "Well," he began slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Your access permissions were updated this morning." "Updated?" He nodded. "Management requested changes." Management. That word had started appearing everywhere lately. "Updated how?" I asked. Tom turned his monitor slightly so I could see the screen. My name appeared in the user database. But the permissions listed next to it were almost empty. No access to accounting servers. No access to payroll. No access to financial archives. 30 years of responsibility gone with a few clicks. I stood there silently for a moment. Tom looked uncomfortable. "I didn't ask questions," he said quietly. "The request came directly from Daniel." "Daniel?" Of course it had. Was anything else changed? I asked. Tom hesitated again. Then he nodded. You're no longer listed as a financial administrator. That sentence landed heavier than the others. Because inside that company, being a financial administrator meant everything. It meant authority over budgets, access to bank accounts, control of payroll systems. Without it, I was just another employee, and not a very useful one. I thanked Tom and walked back to my office. The hallway felt longer than usual. Every step echoed against the quiet office walls. When I reached my desk, someone was already sitting in my chair. Claire. She was scrolling through something on my computer screen. Or at least she had been. The moment I entered, she leaned back calmly. Oh good, she said, smiling as if we were meeting for coffee. I was hoping to catch you. I didn't respond right away. I simply stood in the doorway looking at her. Claire gestured toward the chair across from the desk. Please, she said politely. Sit. I stayed standing. What are you doing in my office? Claire tilted her head slightly. Actually, she said gently, this won't be your office anymore. The words were delivered with the same calm tone someone might use when discussing furniture rearrangements. Daniel and your father agreed that the financial department needs new leadership. I said nothing. Claire continued. You've done admirable work over the years, she added. But the company is moving in a new direction. Her smile never changed. But the systems I built are still here, I said quietly. Claire nodded. Yes. And they're very impressive. She paused. That's why we'll be reviewing them carefully. Reviewing them. The same word she had used during the meeting. Now I understood exactly what it meant. They weren't just reviewing the systems. They were trying to understand them. Trying to replace me. Claire stood up and walked toward the door. As she passed me, she stopped briefly. There's a severance package waiting for you with HR, she said. Then she added something else. Something that explained everything. You should take it. I looked at her. Why? Claire smiled slightly. Because fighting this will only make things harder for you. With that, she walked out of the office. I sat down slowly in the chair across from my own desk. The office looked the same as it had the day before. Same files. Same framed certificates on the wall. But now it felt like someone else's workspace. After a few minutes, there was a knock on the door. My father stepped inside. He didn't sit down. He stood near the doorway, his hands resting in the pockets of his jacket. You spoke with Claire? He asked. Yes. He nodded once. She explained the situation. I looked at him. For 30 years I had trusted this man more than anyone else in the world. Did you approve this? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Then he said something that felt colder than anything Claire had said. You've been part of the company long enough, he replied. But it's time for the next generation to lead. The next generation. Daniel. And Claire. I let the silence stretch between us. Then I asked the question that mattered most. What happens if I don't accept the severance? My father met my eyes. And for the first time that morning he didn't look confident. Then, he said quietly, the company's lawyers will handle it. That was the moment I realized something important. My parents weren't just pushing me out. They were preparing for a fight. And if they were willing to bring lawyers into it, then sooner or later we would all end up in a courtroom. After my father left my office that morning, I didn't follow him. I didn't go to HR. And I didn't sign the severance papers Claire had mentioned. Instead, I sat there quietly for a long time, staring at the desk where I had spent most of my adult life. 30 years. 3 decades of early mornings and late nights. 3 decades of believing that building something together meant we were protecting each other. But somewhere along the way the rules had changed. And no one had bothered to tell me. Around noon I packed a few things into a cardboard box. Not much. A framed photo of the company's first warehouse from the early 1980s. An old calculator I'd used for years before everything moved to digital systems. And a small notebook where I had once written down the formulas that eventually became the backbone of our financial forecasting model. Strange how the things that matter most in life can fit inside a single box. When I walked through the office carrying it, a few employees looked up. Some of them knew what was happening. Others only sensed that something had changed. One of the warehouse supervisors stepped toward me. Are you leaving? He asked quietly. I forced a small smile. For now, I said. He nodded slowly. No one asked more questions. In companies like ours, people learn quickly when silence is safer than curiosity. By the time I reached the parking lot, Daniel was standing beside his car. He had probably seen me through the office windows. Leaving already? He asked. His tone wasn't hostile, but it wasn't friendly either. It was the kind of tone people use when they believe a situation has already been decided. I'm heading home, I said. Daniel leaned against the car door. You should think about what Claire told you, he said. The severance package is generous. I looked at him. For someone who's apparently useless? I asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. You're taking this personally. I almost laughed at that. Personally. I repeated. You removed my access to the company I built my entire career around. Daniel shook his head. You didn't build it, he said calmly. Dad did. There it was. The rewritten version of history. I studied his face for a moment. You really believe that? I asked. Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he looked away toward the warehouse. Things change, he said finally. Companies grow. Leadership evolves. I nodded slowly. Then I got into my car and drove away. Because arguing with someone who has already decided what the truth is rarely changes anything. 2 days later, a letter arrived at my house. The envelope was thick, stamped with the logo of a law firm I recognized immediately. They had represented the company during several contract disputes over the years. I opened the envelope at my kitchen table. Inside was a formal legal notice. The company, technically my father's company, was requesting that I sign documents confirming I had no ownership stake, no executive authority, and no legal claim to the business. The language was cold, precise. Every sentence carefully written to erase 30 years of work. Near the end of the letter was a warning. If I refused to sign the documents within 10 days, the company would pursue legal action to formally confirm their position in court. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. For most of my life I had avoided conflict, especially with my family. But sitting there at my kitchen table that afternoon, something finally became clear. They weren't just asking me to leave quietly. They wanted something more permanent. They wanted legal proof that I had never mattered. That my decades of work had been nothing more than a favor they had allowed me to perform. That the systems I had built, the financial structure I had designed, the countless decisions that had kept the company alive during difficult years, had never belonged to me in any meaningful way. And they were willing to go to court to prove it. That evening, I opened my laptop and logged into the private archive I had copied from the company server years earlier. The same archive I had reviewed the night I realized Claire was planning to remove me. The documents were all still there. Loan agreements, financial authorizations, compliance certifications. Every moment the company had needed credibility with banks or auditors, my name had been there. My signature. My responsibility. For years, I had never imagined those documents would matter to anyone outside the company. But now they mattered very much. Because if my parents wanted to turn this into a legal fight, then the story would no longer belong to them alone. It would belong to the evidence. The next morning I made a phone call. The attorney who answered had been practicing corporate law for more than 40 years. I had met him once before during a banking negotiation almost 2 decades earlier. When I explained the situation, he listened quietly. Then he asked a simple question. Do you have documentation of your role in the company's financial structure? I looked at the archive open on my screen. Yes, I said. Quite a lot. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then the lawyer said something that made the entire situation feel very different. Well, he replied calmly, then perhaps your parents should be careful about what they say in court. And that was the moment I realized something important. They believed the courtroom would be the place where they finally erased me. But if this case really went to trial, that same courtroom might be where the truth about the company was finally revealed. 3 months later, we were standing in a courtroom. Not a large one. Just a quiet county courtroom in downtown Columbus, the kind used for civil disputes and business litigation. The walls were plain wood, the lighting a little too bright, and the air carried that familiar mix of old paper and floor polish. I arrived early with my attorney. We sat at the long wooden table reserved for the defense while the clerk organized documents at the front of the room. My lawyer Richard Hale had spent 4 decades working corporate cases. He wasn't loud or theatrical the way some attorneys are. He was quiet, precise, the kind of person who preferred facts to arguments. As he reviewed the files in front of him, he leaned toward me slightly. "Remember," he said calmly, "today isn't about emotions." I nodded. "It's about evidence." Across the room the doors opened. My parents walked in. My father first. He moved with the same stiff confidence he had carried his entire life, his suit perfectly pressed, his chin lifted slightly like a man who believed he had already won. My mother followed beside him. Claire and Daniel walked behind them. Claire looked around the courtroom with polite curiosity, as if she were attending a business conference rather than a legal dispute involving her own family. Daniel avoided looking in my direction. Their attorney entered last. Tall, confident, carrying a thick binder under his arm. He greeted Richard with a brief professional nod before taking his seat at the opposite table. Courtrooms have a strange kind of quiet before hearings begin. People shuffle papers. Lawyers whisper to their clients. The clerk types notes into a computer. But underneath all of that activity there's a tension in the room. Everyone knows something important is about to happen. That morning I could feel it. Because once the hearing began, the story my parents had been telling for months would finally be spoken out loud, in front of a judge. And once a story is spoken in court, it becomes part of the official record. The judge entered a few minutes later. Everyone stood. He was the same judge who had been assigned the case from the beginning, a tall man with silver hair and a careful way of studying the room before saying anything. When he sat down we all took our seats again. The clerk read the case name aloud. My father's company versus me. Even hearing it that way still felt strange. For 30 years that company had been part of my life. Now it was officially listed as my opponent. My parents' attorney stood first. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "this case concerns a simple misunderstanding regarding family expectations and corporate ownership." He spoke clearly, confidently, as if the outcome had already been decided. The plaintiff, Mr. Robert Langford, founded Langford Logistics more than 40 years ago. He remains the sole legal owner of the business. He gestured slightly in my direction. The defendant, his daughter, worked for the company for many years in a supporting administrative role. Administrative. That word again. She is now claiming that her employment somehow entitles her to an ownership interest in the business. The attorney paused. Then he added a line that sounded carefully prepared. But the company records clearly demonstrate that she held no executive authority, no ownership shares, and no contractual claim to the company's assets. Across the room my father nodded slowly. Claire folded her hands neatly in her lap. Daniel stared straight ahead. The story sounded very clean, very simple. A father, a daughter, a misunderstanding. But then the attorney said something else. Something that made several people in the courtroom shift slightly in their seats. In fact, he continued, the defendant's role in the company was largely informal. He glanced briefly toward my parents. Mr. Langford and his wife have generously supported their daughter for decades by allowing her to remain employed at the company. Supported. Allowed. The words floated in the quiet courtroom. And suddenly the story wasn't just about business anymore. Now it was about family. About a daughter who had apparently lived off her parents' generosity. A few people in the gallery exchanged quiet looks. Because stories like that are easy to understand. Easy to believe. Especially when they come from confident voices. The attorney finished his opening statement with one final sentence. For these reasons, Your Honor, the plaintiff simply requests a legal confirmation of what the corporate records already show. That the defendant has no ownership stake in the business. He sat down. The room was quiet again. My parents looked satisfied. Claire leaned slightly toward Daniel and whispered something that made him smile faintly. They believed the story had been told. They believed the judge had heard everything that mattered. Richard closed the folder in front of him. Then he stood. No dramatic gestures. No raised voice. Just calm. Your Honor, he said. Before we respond to the plaintiff's argument, there is one question we would like the court to consider. The judge looked up. Yes. Richard picked up a single document from the stack. If the defendant truly had no meaningful role in the company, he paused. Then he placed the document on the evidence table. Why does her signature appear on every financial authorization that kept the company alive for the past 30 years? The room went completely silent. Even the clerk stopped typing. Across the courtroom, my father's confident expression shifted for the first time. And beside him, Claire stopped smiling. For a moment, no one in the courtroom moved. My attorney's question seemed to hang in the air, heavier than any argument that had been made so far. The judge leaned slightly forward. "Counsel," he said to Richard, "please clarify what document you are referring to." Richard nodded. "Of course, Your Honor." He lifted the paper from the evidence table and handed it to the court clerk, who carried it to the judge's bench. "This," Richard continued, "is a financial authorization agreement signed in 1994 between Langford Logistics and First State Bank." The judge adjusted his glasses and began reading. Across the room, my father's attorney stood up. "Your Honor, I'm not sure how this document is relevant." The judge raised a hand without looking up. "Sit down, counsel." The attorney slowly returned to his seat. The courtroom fell quiet again. The judge turned a page in the document, then another. His expression didn't change, but he took noticeably longer to read the next section. "Mr. Hale," he said finally, "this appears to be a banking compliance agreement." "Yes, Your Honor." "And the defendant's name appears here as financial supervisor?" "That's correct." Across the room, my father shifted in his chair. My mother leaned toward their attorney and whispered something urgently. Claire's posture had changed too. She wasn't leaning comfortably anymore. She was sitting perfectly still. Richard continued calmly. "Your Honor, during the early 1990s recession, Langford Logistics faced a severe financial crisis. The company lost 2 major contracts and was on the verge of losing its operating credit line." The judge nodded slightly. "That happens frequently with small logistics companies." "Yes, Your Honor. In this case, the bank refused to extend further credit unless a certified financial supervisor assumed responsibility for the company's financial structure." Richard paused. Then he gestured toward me. "That supervisor was the defendant." A quiet murmur moved through the gallery. The judge looked back down at the document. "And this signature is hers?" "Yes." The judge turned another page. "And this agreement allowed the company to maintain its credit line?" "Yes, Your Honor." Across the room, my father's attorney stood again. "Your Honor," he said quickly, "even if the defendant signed certain administrative documents, that does not grant her ownership of the business." Richard nodded slightly. "That's correct." The attorney seemed relieved for a moment, but Richard continued. "However," he said calmly, "that is not the only document we intend to present." He opened a second folder. Inside were several more files. Loan agreements, financial certifications, bank authorizations. Richard handed them to the clerk one by one. 1998 expansion loan authorization. Another document followed. 2003 financial restructuring certification. Another. 2009 compliance verification during the national credit crisis. Each document contained the same thing. My name. My signature. My responsibility. The judge reviewed the growing stack of papers. After a few moments, he looked toward my parents' attorney. "Counsel," he said carefully, "you stated earlier that the defendant had no meaningful role in the company." "Yes, Your Honor." The judge tapped one of the documents with his pen. "Then perhaps you can explain why the company's survival during multiple financial crises appears to have required her authorization." The attorney hesitated. "Just briefly. But everyone in the courtroom noticed it." "Well," he said finally, "many businesses rely on accountants or consultants for financial advice." "That may be true," the judge replied, "but consultants do not normally assume legal responsibility for corporate financial compliance." The room went silent again. I could feel the shift happening slowly. Not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. The clean, simple story my parents' attorney had told earlier was beginning to unravel. Because documents have a way of telling their own story. And once those documents appear in court, they become very difficult to ignore. Richard turned slightly toward the judge again. Your Honor, the plaintiff's argument rests on the idea that the defendant was merely an employee. The judge nodded. That is my understanding. Richard lifted one final document. This, he said, is the financial system certification submitted to the State Regulatory Board in 2012. The clerk handed it to the judge. The judge read quietly for several seconds. Then his eyebrows lifted slightly. Interesting, he said. Across the room, Claire leaned forward. My father stared at the table. Daniel's jaw tightened, because they all understood something at the same moment. The judge had just reached the part of the document that described the person responsible for designing the company's entire financial structure. And the name listed there was mine. The judge placed the document back on the desk. Then he looked across the courtroom toward my parents' attorney. Counsel, he said slowly, are you absolutely certain your client's daughter had no meaningful role in building this company? The attorney opened his mouth, but for the first time that morning, he didn't seem sure what to say next. For several seconds after the judge asked his question, the courtroom remained completely still. The silence felt different now. Earlier that morning, the quiet had belonged to my parents. Their story had sounded clean, confident, simple enough for anyone to understand. But now the silence belonged to the documents. And documents have a way of shifting the balance in a room. My parents' attorney cleared his throat. Your Honor, he began carefully, while these documents may show that the defendant assisted with financial oversight, that still does not establish ownership of the company. His voice was still professional, still controlled. But the confidence from earlier had faded. The judge nodded slowly. You are correct, he said. These documents do not automatically establish ownership. Across the room, my father relaxed slightly. Claire leaned back again. For a moment, they seemed to believe the situation had stabilized. But the judge hadn't finished speaking. What they do establish, he continued, is that the defendant played a significant operational role in the company's financial survival. The judge turned another page in the stack of documents. Then he looked toward my father. Mr. Langford, he said calmly, were you aware that several of these agreements required your daughter to assume legal responsibility for the company's financial compliance? My father hesitated, just long enough for the room to notice. Yes, he said finally. But that was only because she worked in accounting. The judge watched him carefully. In accounting, he repeated. My father nodded. She handled the numbers. The judge placed the documents back on his desk. Then he asked another question. Who designed the company's financial system? The question seemed simple. But no one answered right away. My father shifted in his chair. Daniel stared at the table. Claire's eyes moved briefly toward their attorney. Finally, my father spoke again. It was a team effort, he said. The judge leaned back slightly. A team effort, he repeated. Then he looked at Richard. Mr. Hale, do you have documentation related to that question? Richard nodded. Yes, Your Honor. He opened another folder. Inside were several printed reports. This is the original financial architecture proposal submitted to First State Bank during the company's expansion negotiations in 1998. The clerk carried the document to the judge. This proposal outlines the internal financial control system that allowed the company to qualify for its expansion credit line. The judge began reading. The courtroom was silent again. Then he reached the final page. And this time he spoke the words out loud. The system was designed by the defendant. A faint ripple moved through the gallery. Not loud. Just enough to show that people were beginning to understand the situation differently. The judge looked up. Mr. Langford, he said, addressing my father again. Did your daughter design this system? My father hesitated. His attorney leaned toward him and whispered something. But the judge was waiting. Yes, my father said quietly. She worked on it. The judge tilted his head slightly. She worked on it, he repeated. Then he tapped the document with his pen. This report states that the system was entirely developed by her. Another silence settled over the room. Across the courtroom, I could see Claire watching the judge carefully now. Her earlier confidence had disappeared. Because the story that had been presented at the beginning of the hearing was no longer holding together. At first, I had been described as a daughter who occasionally helped with administrative work. Then the documents showed that I had supervised financial compliance. Now the court was reading proof that I had designed the company's entire financial structure. Each step made the earlier version of events harder to believe. The judge folded his hands. "Counsel," he said to my parents' attorney, "your argument is that the defendant had no meaningful role in the company." "That is correct, Your Honor. And yet the documents presented today suggest she was responsible for the company's financial survival, its regulatory compliance, and the development of its financial control system." The attorney hesitated again. "Well, she was an employee." The judge nodded slightly. "An employee," he repeated. Then he asked one more question. "Do you know how many companies fail because they lack proper financial oversight?" The attorney didn't answer. "Quite a few," the judge continued. "And according to these documents, this company survived several major financial crises largely because of the defendant's work." The judge looked down at the evidence again. Then he said something that made the entire courtroom feel different. "This case may not be as simple as it first appeared." Across the room, my father's shoulders stiffened. Daniel finally looked in my direction. And Claire, for the first time that morning, looked worried. Because the story they had planned to tell in court was no longer the only story the judge was hearing. The courtroom remained quiet after the judge's last statement. "This case may not be as simple as it first appeared." Those words seemed to settle over the room like a weight, because everyone understood what they meant. The story that had been presented earlier, the one about a father generously employing a daughter who had contributed very little, was beginning to collapse under its own contradictions. My parents' attorney stood again, adjusting his jacket. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "even if the defendant contributed to certain financial operations, the legal ownership of the company has always remained with Mr. Langford." The judge nodded. "Yes," he said calmly. "Ownership is indeed an important matter." For a moment, the tension in the room eased slightly. Because on paper, my father was still listed as the sole owner. But then the judge picked up one of the documents again. The financial certification from 2012. He studied it for a long moment. Then he asked another question. "Counsel," he said to my parents' attorney, "are you familiar with the concept of fiduciary responsibility in corporate financial management?" The attorney hesitated slightly. "Yes, Your Honor." "And would you agree that the person who designs and oversees a company's financial control system carries a significant level of responsibility for that company's stability?" "Yes, Your Honor." The judge nodded again. Then he looked across the courtroom, this time directly at my father. "Mr. Langford," he said quietly, "when your company sought regulatory approval for expansion in 2012, who was listed as the responsible financial architect?" My father didn't answer immediately. The judge waited. Finally, my father spoke. "My daughter," he said. The word sounded strange in the room. "Not the defendant. Not an employee. Just my daughter." The judge leaned back slightly in his chair. "And when your company negotiated its expansion credit line with First State Bank," he continued, "whose financial certification allowed the bank to approve the loan?" My father shifted again. Again there was a pause. Then he answered. "Hers." The judge nodded slowly. "And during the credit crisis in 2009, whose restructuring plan allowed the company to maintain its operating capital?" The silence lasted longer this time. Daniel looked at the table. Claire stared straight ahead. My father exhaled. "Hers," he said again. The judge placed the documents neatly back into the folder. Then he looked toward my parents' attorney. "Counsel," he said calmly, "your argument rests on the claim that the defendant had no meaningful role in the company." "Yes, Your Honor." The judge lifted his pen. "But according to the evidence presented, the defendant designed the company's financial structure, supervised its regulatory compliance, secured its expansion financing, and prevented its collapse during multiple economic downturns." He paused. Then he asked the question that changed everything. "Is that an accurate summary of her involvement?" The attorney opened his mouth, closed it, then said quietly, "Yes, Your Honor." A faint whisper moved through the gallery. Not loud, but enough to show that people were beginning to understand the situation clearly now. Because the image that had been presented earlier, the idea of a daughter who had merely been allowed to work at the company, no longer matched the facts being discussed in court. The judge looked down at the documents one more time. Then he looked directly at my parents. His voice was calm, but the question he asked next carried a weight that no one in the room could ignore. If the defendant was responsible for designing and maintaining the financial systems that allowed this company to survive and grow, he paused. Then he finished the sentence. Why does the plaintiff now describe her as a useless daughter? The words landed heavily in the quiet room. Across the courtroom, my mother lowered her eyes. My father didn't respond. Even their attorney didn't attempt to answer, because there was no legal argument that could easily explain it. For the first time that morning, the judge's expression changed slightly. Not anger, not sympathy, but something closer to concern. Family disputes involving businesses are unfortunately common, he said. But when such disputes reach a courtroom, this court must rely on evidence. He gestured lightly toward the stack of documents. And the evidence presented today shows a level of professional responsibility that contradicts the description given earlier. The judge closed the folder. The quiet in the courtroom felt different now. Earlier, the silence had belonged to my parents' story. Now it belonged to the truth slowly unfolding in front of everyone. The judge turned toward Richard. Mr. Hale, he said, do you have any additional evidence you would like the court to review? Richard nodded. Yes, Your Honor. He reached into his folder and removed one final document. A thin single-page report. This, he said, placing it carefully on the evidence table, is the certification submitted to the State Financial Regulatory Board when Langford Logistics expanded its operations across state lines. The clerk handed the document to the judge. The judge read it quietly. Then he looked up again. And this time his expression changed completely, because the line he had just read answered a question no one in the courtroom had expected. And in the next few moments, the same courtroom where my parents had once laughed while calling me useless was about to hear something that would make them wish they had never brought this case to trial. The judge held the final document in his hands for several seconds. No one in the courtroom spoke. Not my parents. Not their attorney. Not even the clerk typing notes at the front desk. The quiet felt heavier than anything that had been said all morning, because everyone in that room could sense it. Something important had just been discovered. The judge adjusted his glasses and read the line again. Then he looked up. Mr. Hale, he said, addressing my attorney. This certification appears to list the defendant as the primary financial architect responsible for the company's interstate compliance approval. Yes, Your Honor, Richard replied calmly. The judge turned the page again. And according to this document, without that certification, the company would not have been legally permitted to expand its operations across state lines. That is correct. Across the room, Daniel slowly lifted his head. Claire's expression had completely changed now. The confident smile she carried into the courtroom that morning was gone. My father stared at the table in front of him. The judge placed the document down carefully. Then he spoke again. Mr. Langford, he said. My father looked up. Is this document accurate? My father hesitated. For the first time that day he looked unsure. The man who had built his reputation on certainty suddenly seemed smaller sitting in that chair. Yes, he said quietly. It's accurate. The judge nodded once. Then he said something that seemed to echo through the entire room. So the company's expansion into multiple states, he paused, was only possible because of your daughter's financial system. My father didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. And in a courtroom, silence often speaks louder than words. The judge folded his hands. For several seconds, he simply looked at the documents spread across his desk. Loan agreements, compliance certifications, financial authorizations, 30 years of history, 30 years of signatures, 30 years of decisions that had kept the company alive. Finally, he spoke again. This court is not here to rewrite family history, he said calmly, but it is responsible for understanding the truth behind the evidence presented. He looked toward my parents' attorney. You argued earlier that the defendant had no meaningful role in the company. The attorney said nothing. The judge continued. However, the documents before this court demonstrate that the defendant designed the company's financial systems, supervised its regulatory compliance, secured its expansion financing, and assumed legal responsibility during multiple financial crises. He paused. Then he added something no one in the room expected. In many organizations, the individual responsible for those functions would be considered indispensable. The word hung in the air. Indispensable. The exact opposite of useless. The judge leaned forward slightly. This court cannot ignore the contradiction between the plaintiff's description of the defendant and the documented reality of her contributions. Across the room, my mother looked down at her hands. Claire shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Daniel stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. The story they had brought to court was no longer the story the evidence supported. The judge picked up his pen. Given the extent of the defendant's documented role in the company's financial structure and survival, he said, this court finds that the matter cannot be resolved through a simple declaration of ownership as requested by the plaintiffs. My father's attorney leaned forward. Your Honor. But the judge raised his hand. I am not finished. The room fell silent again. This court recognizes that while Mr. Langford may be the legal founder of the company, he paused. The evidence strongly indicates that the company's operational and financial foundation was built through the defendant's work over several decades. Another quiet ripple moved through the gallery. The judge continued. Therefore, the request to dismiss the defendant's claims outright is denied. Across the courtroom, Claire's face went pale. Daniel's eyes widened slightly. My father closed his eyes for a moment, because they all understood what that sentence meant. The case was not over. But the story they had brought to court had already lost its power. The judge closed the folder. This matter will proceed to full review regarding the defendant's contributions and any potential claims arising from them. He looked directly at my parents. Then he said one final thing. Regardless of the outcome, the evidence presented today makes one point very clear. The room was completely still. Calling the defendant a useless daughter, he paused, was not supported by the facts. The gavel struck softly against the wood. Court is adjourned. People began standing. Papers shuffled. Chairs moved across the floor. But I remained seated for a moment. Not because I was overwhelmed. Not because I felt victorious, but because something inside me had finally settled. For months my parents had tried to erase the story of my life. They had rewritten it, reduced it, dismissed it. But in that courtroom, the truth had spoken for itself. Not through anger, not through arguments, through evidence. As I stood up, Richard gathered the documents and placed them back into his folder. He looked at me and gave a small nod. That went well, he said quietly. I nodded. Across the room, my parents were already speaking urgently with their attorney. Claire no longer looked confident. Daniel avoided my direction entirely. But my father looked up once. For a brief moment our eyes met. There was something different in his expression now. Not anger. Not pride. Something closer to realization. Perhaps for the first time, he understood the weight of the words that had been spoken in that courtroom. I walked toward the exit slowly. The courthouse hallway was quiet. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Behind me the courtroom doors closed. And with them, the version of the story where I had been a useless daughter. For 30 years I had helped build a company. But that day, in a quiet courtroom in Columbus, I built something else. The truth.